Melemai Kaleni Muniz. I am Kanako Iwi, so I'm Native Hawaiian. And first and foremost, I just want to thank you all for being here today. This is a conversation, decolonization in the law. This is a conversation we need to start having. It's a conversation that's not being had often enough. And although we've made quite a bit of progress, I do think we're in a situation now where we have a choice to make about what it means to create a truly equitable future for not just people of color, but everybody who has been subjugated and exploited through capitalism and colonialism in all its forms. So we have an amazing panel today. We have Jennifer Tucker from the University of New Mexico, Lauren Van Schiffgaard from UCLA, Chase Ironeyes from the Lakota Law Project, and Ben Mansky from George Mason University. So if you would like to introduce yourselves, Jennifer Tucker.
Great, wonderful. It's so great to be with you all today. I'm an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico in the Department of Community and Regional Planning. I'm also a white anti-racist feminist, speaking to you from unceded Tiwa land, also known as Albuquerque. And my training is actually as a critical urban planning scholar and a longtime activist, learning from and alongside frontline communities in a range of social justice struggles. My reflections today come out of my work around abolitionist organizing in Albuquerque, as well as a decade-long ethnographic research project on the largest illicit border economy in the hemisphere on the Paraguay-Brazil border in a town called Ciudad del Este, Paraguay. And this panel has got me thinking about some starting points or some principles for how we might contest what I've been thinking about as the coloniality of law. I'll put those in the chat because I'm only going to have a time in the short framing comments to focus on two. And I want to focus on two that I think I can offer, hopefully, a different, unique perspective on. And the first is the foundational role of elite illegalities in colonial racial capitalism. And the second is how whiteness naturalizes or makes seem normal elite forms of transgressive profiteering and possession, what I think of as elite illegalities. And I want to argue that these dynamics are behind today's deepening inequalities, behind the vast hoarding of wealth by a very small number of people. We heard a little bit about that from Richard Wolff in the prior session, but also as forms of unaccountable political power, even though these aren't very studied dynamics. So my principle or starting point number 3 is that illegalities are a terrain of race-class conflict. And what I mean by that, so law is an expression of colonial power. I think many of us have an understanding of that. The law is not neutral. It is instituted actually to redistribute wealth and social power upward, and also to help us think about the social construction of criminality, but also the politics of enforcement, whose transgressions are punished, whose are let slide. And my argument is that both these are arenas in which the contestation of social wealth and power are contested. And so this helps us think about how elites shape law and policy in order to redistribute power and social wealth upward. We can think about the Pandora Papers, which reveal that elites shelter some $11 trillion in tax avoiding wealth in tax havens. We can think about South Dakota, which is now specializing in tax avoidance and evasion, becoming the new Cayman Islands. Very curious also to think about how this is also a place where law has been used to repress water protectors and Standing Rock. And elites protect their illegalities. James Holston, an anthropologist, calls this a habit of wealth. There's so many examples, right? Trump, full stop. The constant and unrelenting violations, treaty violations of sovereign indigenous nations. And this is also where my work fits in, where I show how the city, Ciudad del Este, was built through both uneven development, but then also state projects to build a whole city to circulate contraband. It's a city that was built from above by state actors and elites, but also below from ordinary traders and street vendors who were contesting the distribution of wealth through globalization and producing a kind of globalization from below. We also know that the transgression of the poor are often criminalized in survival economies and harshly punished. And I've been thinking with the French theorist Michel Foucault, who gives us a concept of the economy of illegalities to think about these dynamics, which he describes as techniques to differentially administer, punish, or allow illegalities. This is a historical argument looking at how elites and the rise of emerging capitalist states separated what Foucault calls the illegalities of property, which are crimes like theft, trespassing, and way back when poaching on landed estates, from what he calls the illegality of rights, which is the power to transgress the law without being punished. He insists that these domains are related by a class opposition, in which the illegalities of property are the domains of the poor, while he says the bourgeoisie reserves to itself the illegality of rights, the possibility of getting around its own rules and regulations and laws, of ensuring for itself an immense sector of economic circulation by a skillful manipulation of gaps in the law. So I want to emphasize 2 points here. One is that elite illegalities are normalized, protected, but also importantly integrated into global capitalism. And secondly, that prisons and policing emerged to target and spatially contain the livelihood transgressions of the poor, understood as the illegality of property, which Foucault also thinks of as the social field, which is understood as delinquency. These produce really tricky dynamics, and there aren't easy solutions, but I think we need to start to pay attention to these dynamics around the economy of illegalities. The second point, which is my principle 4, maybe I should put it in the chat again in case you just joined, these sort of starting points for how I'm thinking about how we can contest the coloniality of law, which is that whiteness naturalizes transgressive forms of possession. Essentially that it makes whiteness naturalizes illegalities. So when I'm thinking about whiteness, I'm not just thinking about a privileged individual or subject position, not just the unearned advantages that flow to individual white people, but also a practice and an entitlement to own, to take, to enclose, to dispossess. George Lipsitz calls whiteness a racial cartel. I love this framing because it emphasizes the hoarding of resources through what Clyde Woods might call an ethno-class alliance. And it also invokes how whiteness produces the individual, or in academic terms, the subject position of the entitled lawbreaker, someone who is so confused by cultures of supremacy that they hold themselves above the law, even as they might deploy law and order rhetoric as a tool of oppression to quell dissent and punish the survival economies of the poor. And just to emphasize that while these trends might benefit people who are phenotypically white, members of other racial groups can also be enrolled in these dynamics of whiteness. And so one contribution of my forthcoming book, I'll put something in the chat in a second about that, is to draw out how these dynamics work using the Paraguayan vernacular critique of blancamiento, which means whitening, to demonstrate actually how this works, how the crimes of the powerful are whitewashed, but also emphasizing that these elite illegalities aren't like an individual moral failing of a corrupt individual, but actually part of the social relations of colonial racial capitalism, in which whiteness includes these forms of transgressive profit making. And I've called this accumulation by transgression in my writing. And the reason that I think this is so important, I think it's a huge underappreciated challenge for social movements and those of us trying to build worlds otherwise, because these forms of elite illegalities produce not only vast stores of hoarded wealth, but also unaccountable powers. It can also be a way to, if we understand these dynamics, to reveal the ruses of capitalism, sort of the mythology of capitalism as a supposedly meritocratic rule-abiding system, but we actually can see how it's interconnected to this sort of submerged, hidden, sometimes secretive, sometimes open secret kind of world of transgressive forms of profit making. And so I think there might be an opportunity to sort of tap into people's sense of fairness as we look to build critical awareness and understanding around the actually existing social relations of capitalism, and to reclaim some of the stolen wealth as our own. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I really like that idea of the ruses of capitalism. I think that's really poignant and pointed at what it is that we're trying to get towards. How do we create something knowing that there are all these ruses of capitalism that does actually, we all buy into it to some extent, right? And so it's an interesting conversation to be had. Lauren, if you would like to go, please.
Sure. Thank you for having me. What an act to follow, Jennifer. My name is Lauren Van Schilfgaard. I'm an assistant professor at the UCLA School of Law. I'm a member of Cocha de Pueblo. I grew up in Albuquerque, calling from Burbank, California, home of the Tongva, Tataviam, Chumash, and many others. I'm honored to be here. Much of my work is looking at federal Indian law, tribal law, international Indigenous studies. I also had the honor and privilege of working with David Cobb, Michelle Vassell, and the Wiyot tribe, looking at work around the tribal land trust, which I think is a beautiful analogy for some of the ways I'm starting to think about these. So I'm particularly interested in tribes and tribal systems. And because of contact and colonization, the ways that tribes operate and exist today is very much in response to and a reflection of federal Indian policies and the ways that the dominant Western society, but most notably the American government, tolerates and has a palette for expressions of tribal sovereignty. As I've come to look at a more global Indigenous community, I'm starting to better understand the ways in which Native people within the United States operate and how that compares and contrasts. It's merely a point of comparison, and so I'm attempting not to let that limit my framing. But in a lot of ways, Indigenous people in the United States have it kind of good in the sense that there is a recognition of tribal sovereignty. And because sovereignty as a term has been utilized, it necessarily impacts other forms of sovereignty, most notably American sovereignty. And so there is protection in the extent to which tribal sovereignty is constrained, limited, compromised, potentially threatens the broader sovereignty. So in that way, we sort of have a leveraged perspective that recognizes civil and criminal jurisdiction for tribes that does not exist in other parts of the world. Now, of course, that's like where the good news ends. There is lots of examples of the ways in which the American government has nevertheless seen fit to constrain expressions of tribal sovereignty, particularly as the power balance has shifted over time. And yet we're also starting to see tribal expressions of sovereignty become more and more normalized. The ways in which tribes act as governments, provide services, have hospitals, is becoming expected. That's notable because I think in the 19th century, federal Indian policy tolerated expressions of tribal sovereignty because politically they were compelled, but there was an assumption that tribes were nevertheless going to go away. They were going to disappear, if not because of explicit genocidal actions or merely because of a passive assimilation into the American melting pot. There was an assumption that tribes and Native people are temporary. I think now today we're starting to prove that that was always a fallacy, but even more so today, Native people are thriving, as is expressions of tribal governance. However, even the notion of a tribe, and especially a tribal government, is a response to a Western understanding of what a sovereign is, a central, hierarchical, usually male-led form of government that I don't think is necessarily reflective of tradition or traditional forms of indigeneity, or even how we identify with each other and the ways that we connect to each other. So I feel like a really interesting dynamic happened that as tribes are sort of responding to the ways in which their existence and their authority is tolerated by the United States and really by the world writ large, but also what it means to be Indigenous and what it means to indigenize things. And so I see there is a very connected, overlapping, necessarily like simultaneous, but ultimately distinct work happening between decolonization and indigenizing systems. And so, the WIAT work was particularly moving for me as they were exploring land back efforts, right, which is very buzzy right now, but is work that Indigenous people have been pursuing since 1493. And so what does it mean to hold land now? Another buzzy term that's happening right now is co-management. Now, on the one hand, co-management is like revolutionary. 5 years ago, it wasn't seem practical or appropriate to turn the keys over, right, to tribes as a decision-making stakeholder in the ways that lands are cared for, or even acknowledging that Indigenous people might have something to contribute to land management, that traditional knowledge is actually technologically very sophisticated and not a remnant of some past antiquated way of living that is no longer relevant in the 21st century. But co-management is and always was step one, right, in land back. I don't want to speak for any Indigenous people. I only really speak for myself, but I think for many communities, their co-management is not the goal in and of itself. It is to return the land to Indigenous control. And part of that is not just about power or authority over others to the exclusion of the many, but rather it is to invoke in land the values that I think have been divested as part of the settler colonial framework that I think Jennifer laid out so beautifully, right? That has, because settlers are strangers, right? They're not from this land. And so I think it was an easy temptation to perceive land purely through an economic lens. What is the profit output of this area? And when I have exhausted this area from everything that it has to give, I can move on to the next land because I don't have a personal connection to this. It is purely a thing. And so that's how we value it. And so an Indigenous injection of values, I think the added is that like there's a lot of reciprocity that we've never really recognized, but it also means that there's no land that's been chewed up that is irredeemable. But it also means that we play a massive part, that a pristine, revitalized land is not defined by the absence of people, but is rather necessarily connected to a relationship with people. That I think is just one of the many like beautiful things that Indigenous people are finally revealing to the greater world, or at least the greater world is finally growing ears to listen to this, that I think is a reflection of sort of the moment that we're in that's really exciting. So this like relationship of indigenization and decolonization, I think is really unique, but I think it's also important to reflect on where tribes are at this moment, because tribal sovereignty is so precarious within federal Indian law, because economic development is so critically important to the ways in which tribes can participate here. It's just a necessary component to respect that different tribes are at different places in this work, but they are necessary stakeholders, not because it's the right thing to do or because it's an altruistic thing to do, but because they're sovereigns and this is their land. And I really respect this conference and this summit sort of centering that and making that part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. I do, as a Native Hawaiian, we do believe in coming from the land and being birthed from the land. And that has, I think, been a defining attribute of other Indigenous people's relationships to the land, of having that reciprocity. If you're born from the land, or if you have some type of familial or reciprocal connection, it totally creates a different type of relationship than a relationship that arises from commodification. And we do know that the commodification of land, right, is related to the commodification of culture and of people. And so I think that's a really interesting conversation. And next up, we have Chase Iron Eyes from Lakota Law Project. If you could please introduce yourself.
Amadakiapi kola iuha ichichab Lila Dayawachiankapelo, Lila Dayahipelo. My name is Chase Iron Eyes. It's very good to see all of you. Very good to be with you all. I'm broadcasting and joining the Zoom a little bit late. I didn't mean to make any of the organizers, I hate that when people are a little bit late. But I was driving, my son's prom and my nephew's prom interceded. And so I come from, wherever you're at, there are sacred lands there that are origin points that have birthed humanity, have birthed the human beings, and have given to us a cosmology and a knowledge system to pierce through a lot of the programming that I hear people speak of in this great gathering. I can tell, and you can feel it, that people are perceiving it. They're putting the best of their insight and their intuitions and their interpretations and their perceptions into breaking down what is it that has really happened to us as human beings. Yes, indigenous nations, which are never called indigenous nations for a reason. We are only ever called indigenous peoples or tribes of federal Indians because the language provides a confining framework within which the law, the jurisprudence, according to how those systems are transmitted in the English thinking universe, in the English speaking traditions, they're coded with all sorts of limitations. And this is important because when I went to law school, no professor pulled me to the side and said, hey, listen, this is actually what's happening in these institutions. We're going to try to assassinate your sovereign understanding or knowledge of what you are and who you are, what your nation is, and who your original independent indigenous nation is. They don't tell you that. They just say Congress, according to our system, has plenary authority over this thing that we've created called a federal Indian. And it's completely relevant today because Pope Francis recently repudiated the doctrine of discovery. That is an earthquake. I've always called Pope Francis the wokest pope. Since he came on the scene, they issued Laudato Si, one of the encyclicals that recognized Mother Earth consciousness, you might say, in many other words, in many other ways of describing that. Those knowledge systems that help us transcend those limitations that were placed on all human beings, that have abstracted and separated and divided the human spirit from the mind, have abstracted or separated our labor from meaning, and have at a very fundamental level taught us that we are separate from all of the universal elemental creation. So indigenous knowledge systems, as you can see, and as some of you did come from those systems, and indeed we all descend from those systems if you look back far enough. And I've gotten in trouble for saying that we are all indigenous, because indigenous is now an international term of art, and I understand that and I respect that. But I believe that we are witnessing right now in our time, because everybody is vulnerable, everybody is in a teachable moment, partly because of the climate crisis, partly because of COVID, what just happened there. People reevaluated everything, the human condition. And I think because of what happened with the thousands of children, the evidence of genocide, of colonial genocide, those children were being unearthed, and that pushed the Pope Pontifex, the top of more than 1 billion Christian thinking individuals, pushed us into this new level of understanding and repudiating the doctrine of discovery. Yes, it might not have an immediate practical impact for me out here on the Pine Ridge Reservation or the Standing Rock Reservation, but it is a groundswell. It is a watershed moment, and I think it's up to us, people like us, who can take that to the next level in all your works and all your practices. So I just want to thank you. It's an honor to be involved in this gathering. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And of course, the doctrine of discovery as the basis of federal Indian law, it is relevant to have conversations about how we can look at something that is so racist and figure out a way to fundamentally change the way in which it impacts Indigenous peoples on the continent. So next up, we have Ben Mansky from George Mason University.
Hi there, it's a real pleasure to be joining everybody here. And I just want to say, first of all, that I'm an assistant professor of public sociology at George Mason University. I've been here going on 3 years now. I'm not from this region. I spent most of my life in Wisconsin, the land of the Fox, the Sauk, the Ho-Chunk, the Anishinaabe peoples. Here in Northern Virginia, the first thing that, of course, hit me as a Wisconsinite was that we're on the lands that were fought over so bloodily in the 1860s, not far from Bull Run, where I was earlier this morning. This is the land of the Doeg people, of the center of Black enslavement in North America, and also the land of the Rappahannock, the Mattaponi, the Chickahominy, Pamunkey, Potawatomi, Monacan, Nansemond, and Nottoway peoples. We've been working here at George Mason University to build a new program that we're calling Next System Studies. So the image you have here from behind, you may recognize a few faces. A few of them are actually here in this Zoom room with us today. We just had a workshop on the promise of Next System Studies. And a lot of my work involves the question of how do we move to a new system, a new political economy, culture, and legal system. I want to speak briefly to the constitutional question here in the United States, but also globally. It has become, I think, increasingly obvious, not just to people at the base of society, but also at the top, that the constitutional order is not working. Certainly for the vast majority of people on this continent and in this country, the constitutional order in the United States is very much out of alignment with priorities that people have around social rights, around personal liberties. And we see the federal courts, including, of course, the Supreme Court of the United States, delivering decision after decision that rejects popular sovereignty and good sense. We've also, of course, had a number of very important struggles that have emerged over questions of sovereignty and of governance in this country. The question of the corporation and corporate power, the question of whether corporations are entitled to the rights that are accorded in the Bill of Rights. The courts in the United States have constructed a doctrine of corporate constitutional rights and enshrined state protection of corporations against we the people here in the US. We also have lived, all of us, through endless war in our lifetimes. And I would argue that this represents in some ways a reverse kind of action by the federal courts, especially the Supreme Court, not only over the last generation and generations, but really over the last 120 years, in which some of the elements of the Constitution of 1787 that are actually perhaps good elements that relate to war powers have been essentially ruled out of the Constitution. The power of Congress to declare war and not of the executive branch to go to war at any time that it chooses. The construction of a massive military industrial complex here in North America, which was something that was actively resisted for many years in this country. So we have a constitutional order which is very much out of step with the needs of the vast majority of people. And that, as I said, is a result in part of action by the courts, but of course it has to do with the original design of the Constitution of 1787 in many ways as well. It's a colonial and post-colonial document. It's a raced and classed document. And so it really shouldn't be any surprise that we in the 21st century have seen rising movements from below for constitutional change in the US, not only for constitutional amendments, whether we're talking about the We the People Amendment or the Right to Vote Amendment, or to the Right to an Education of Quality Amendment, or abolition of the Electoral College, or the Seventh Generation Amendment. It shouldn't be a surprise that we're seeing these kinds of movements. For myself, I'm somebody who comes out of a lot of that work. I've only been a professor for 3 years. I had 30 plus years in the movement before that. Did a lot of work as a public interest lawyer, did a lot of work as an Earth First activist, working with Anishinaabe communities in northern Wisconsin, with the Yakima, with Ho-Chunk, with other folks, certainly Menominee. So I come out of that work, and my research has followed from that. I've really been focused on the question of how this movement for a new constitution in the United States can be most successful. So my doctoral work and the book that I'm working on, basically look to the cases of other countries that went through constitutional revolutions at the end of the 20th century, and ask the question of really what did it take for liberation movements, for democracy movements to be most successful in provoking a process of constitutionalization, and then carrying through and ensuring that the new constitutional order is both formally and also, more importantly, substantively enacted according to the designs of the mass movement from below. And I'm not the only one. There's a growing number of scholars, including in my field of sociology, who have been doing this work. And the findings are pretty consistent. When the movement is more participatory, when it's more inclusive, when it's more revolutionary, which is to say it has a process for involving large numbers of people ahead of time before the constitutional opening. When it has that process, for example, the classic case would be the Freedom Charter in South Africa, but there are others, right? When it has that sort of commitment to a revolutionary constitutional politics, you get more success across the board. I'm happy to share that research with people. But I would say that that may be useful to people here in the US, and it's common sense. Start early, get lots of people involved, be inclusive, develop a participatory process, don't wait. But there are some challenges that we have to take up if we're really taking the question of constitutional change seriously. In the United States, are we talking about a national constitutional project, or are we talking about something else? Are we going to reify, let's to say, reinforce the borders of the United States? Or are we going to take on the question of regional and global governance? And how do we reach out? So that's a question that has to be raised so that we don't simply reinforce the frankly, borders for myself, myself, I'm not interested in any more borders for people, right? So how do we take on that question? Another question that is something that I've been dealing with, but I certainly haven't come to terms with myself, and I'd like to put out there is, what should be the relationship between the 21st century society that has been produced out of colonialism and also post-colonial struggle, and the 21st century First Nations and indigenous peoples of this continent? If you look at other cases, you look at Ecuador, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, certainly Canada to our north, they've all undergone constitutional revolutions of one kind or another. Mexico, 100 years ago, and the relationship of indigenous nations to the post-colonial society have been different in each case in terms of the question of constitutional change. And that's something that has to be grappled with explicitly here in the US. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Ben. So I think the first question that I'm going to just throw out to the group is, how does settler colonialism, racism, and capitalism condition the law? And what are the consequences of this? Jennifer, if you would like to start.
Great. So I think this was my question. So it's like, I guess just that this big question gets tossed right to me. Yeah, I think it's important to consider the law as an expression of colonial racial capitalism, and to understand, this is a little bit about how my comments were oriented, right? That the law is used as a tool to uphold social hierarchies, And I think what I was trying to get at in my comments is how elites have then also sort of carved out this space of action at the same time to generate this field of action where they get to transgress the law. So sort of thinking about that dynamic. I think we need to think about the law as a tool of repression, targeting social movements. And one, I don't think I can give a comprehensive answer to the question because it's so big, but one thing that I'll just sort of toss out, because this might be productive for the group to think about, is the case of South Dakota. We have Chase Iron Eyes here. I certainly have been very inspired by the No DOPL, by the Standing Rock movement. We saw law as a tool of repression. We saw sort of the articulation of law enforcement with legal regimes to undermine the movement. And this is also the place where it's kind of like ground zero for elite illegalities in the US, where we have this new jurisdiction that is essentially established so that elites can hoard ill-gotten wealth. There's a sugar magnate who essentially uses de facto slave labor and is hiding his wealth from prosecution in South Dakota. So we have this like cohabitation of these two different forms of using the law. And so, in my little, maybe I'll put them again. I have these sort of propositions or starting points about how we can use the law in decolonial projects. And I do sort of propose that we can engage with the law strategically, but it is so tricky. And so maybe I'll just leave it there to hear from the other panelists.
I don't necessarily want to lock us going in a particular order. It is a big question. So I guess I'll just what does it make me think of? I study the law, and so it's clearly been manipulated. There's a myth that the law is neutral, or that, in the 19th century, that one doesn't make the law, one discovers the law and their natural law. And so now that's sort of been roundly rejected. And I think there's a lot more explicit that it's no, we're trying to maximize benefits for a certain population, which to the extent that's at least explicit, it's a little bit more genuine. But on the other hand, I think there was also one of the justifications for the exclusion of Native people from property ownership, as is what the doctrine of discovery stands for, but all of these other notions, was that Native people were lawless, that they were on a lower rung of civilization, and thereby it was okay to exclude them from certain rights that are otherwise guaranteed by the law because they were incapable of accessing them. And as Indigenous knowledge and sophistication has become more accepted on the mainstream, there's a recognition that's not only was that absurd, but actual Indigenous philosophies and strategies have everything to be credited for our notions of equality and egalitarian, and as well as ecological sophistication. And so, when I think about the ways in which the law has been manipulated, a lot of that is the exclusion of decision makers in certain participatory circles, and specifically the exclusion of collectives, right? I think one of the potential detriments is the division of communities into just a series of individuals. And it becomes a majority rule, and I think really easy in which case to have these elites. But I'm also really concerned of the do-gooders, or the people that think they're doing good. So much of federal Indian policy are these these evil villains that have committed genocide and these terrible things. But it's also riddled with a lot of people who thought they were helping, but nevertheless fell into a reflex that Native people needed help, that they were incompetent and incapable and needed the incorporation of the adversarial system, or a hierarchical centralized government, or all of these, or boarding schools, or like adoption out, or whatever it was. And so I think to the extent that the law has been used to justify the appropriation and the demotion of other peoples, I think we should be suspect of. And that's where I see like the settler colonial and like the potential like racism and using the law for those means. But I think our work in decolonizing the law and indigenizing the law requires like some reflection about how much is my motivation really coming from a sense that I think I know better, versus we're trying to open up space and like shift the power. That's where I see like the real magic happening.
Am I next? You know what? This is amazing. I think that, you know, I've been a part of several political movements, political organizing. And I think that I really think that those of us who are all on this call should think about how we keep track of each other or just lend support, because I've seen various circles. What I feel happening is like a spiritual brain trust that is possible. Just hearing you guys speak, and like, you know, Professor Tucker made mention of DAPL. For me, when we talk about the you know, how colonization, the racialization of the law, how does collective Western jurisprudence, what is it doing to us? That was not designed for, unless you were a white male. I mean, this is even about the time that they invented whiteness, but a white male property owning demographic. That is what these systems, all of these systems, are designed to privilege and to empower. So I feel that we're just now waking up to the levels of programming, and we see a very real, a very visceral deconstruction of that programming with indigenous nations, because indigenous nations, yes, colonization is very harsh, very brutal, very genocidal, but it didn't kill everything. And so the covenants that we have with what we call the sacred, because we've kept alive those covenants and we conduct and perform those ceremonies that we're obligated to do on behalf of humanity, then you're going to see us out there during DAPL. And I didn't enter that fray right away, but I did when I saw a space that it was necessary for me to provide a legal and spiritual foundation for why we were there, and why the tens of thousands of people who were there were authorized to be there. And we did that in defense of land and water. And so that called into our being a greater consciousness. Our ceremonies are designed like that. So I feel like the defense of land, the defense of water, you see it happening at what do they call that? Remember the young brother was killed down in Atlanta? The forest, defend the forest. You see it happening there. Oak Flat with the Apache, you see it happening there. Thacker Pass, I'm about to go to Thacker Pass with Pihemaha, as they call it. They're defending themselves against the intrusions, the corporate colonial intrusions of what we see as impending fascism. You saw it at DAPL, you see it on Pine Ridge when we wanted to shut down the res to keep ourselves safe when COVID just now came, was a new thing. You know, Native people are put inside these little cages, and when you grow up inside the cage, you don't know it's there, and then you learn to deconstruct it, and you learn to challenge it at every turn. in the same way that the Occupy movement challenged the ruling order, in the same way that when George Floyd was murdered, I mean, our country almost burned to the ground. So for those of us who are paying attention and know that we are in a very malleable and potentially perilous state all the time, thinking about colonization and breaking down the racialization, recognizing that what I call the radical right is very effective. Look how they killed woke. You know, they killed that word, that concept of deconstructing that racialized colonial programming, which for us is for the benefit of all humanity. So, but the culture wars happen at different levels. Some of it is up here where there's, you know, well-researched, thought out and well-analyzed theory. Some of it happens in what can fit into a TikTok or a meme or an infographic, and we need to be present in all of those spaces. So I just want to offer that for that question.
Yeah, and I'll say that for me, I think about going back to the constitutional question, sort of the basic law, how do we organize ourselves? I think about what's not in our constitutional documents right now, but that is emergent from all these movements or parts of the larger movement today. So how do we take on the question of the racial wealth gap and reparations for Black slavery? How do we take on the question of bordering and the movement of people, right? And making sure that no one is illegal, right? How do we take on the question of land back and of stewardship and of co-management as it was raised earlier? How do we take on the question of you know, establishing, as others have written, ecological personhood, rights of nature, rights of other beings, rights of all beings in our law? How do we take on the rights of future generations and build into our constitutional discussions, you know, the things that are already being raised up earlier? You know, my colleague from UCLA, Lauren, you raised you know, the question of collectives. You know, how do we build the solidarity economy into a new constitutional order? And for me, the answer to that, or one of the answers to that, always comes back to engaging as many people as possible in these questions. So that when I talk about revolutionary constitutionalism, that's what I'm referring to. When I was down in Caracas in 2006, you know, people were buying, not just selling, but buying copies of the Bolivarian Constitution. People were carrying them around and having conversations on the street. That kind of popular law tradition has a history in the US and it's complex. It's contested, but we need a popular law tradition to come back that's much more, yeah. So that's something that I'm sort of focused on. How do we have these conversations in as many places as possible, but also have them be part of a meaningful process that leads to developing common agreements about what the next system looks like?
That's really interesting. I think, especially thinking about it in the way that Chase proposed it, as well as Lauren, how is it that we can empower Indigenous peoples to take up space in order to create, you know, whatever their traditional ways of being are, because it really is truly for the equity of all, right? Like, we often talk about justice and what does the pursuit of justice really mean? And I think understanding that because Indigenous peoples, like, innately the way in which we were set up traditionally are cultural sovereignty, political sovereignty, even economic sovereignty, that can actually help with the freedom of all, of everyone, regardless of whether or not they're Indigenous. Is there a way that you all have been just like thinking about what it actually, the end goal is for decolonizing the law? Because I think as we talk about decolonizing the law, we're working towards something, right? We already recognize systemic racism is real and it's part of the conversation now, so much more than it was before. But the conversation seems to stop there. How is it that we can start working towards something, and what would that something be in the way in which we're like conceptualizing, decolonizing, or indigenizing the law?
So for me, I think when I think about using the law strategically, I think about sort of Yeah, I think that decolonization or abolition or these sort of end goals are a little bit different than decolonizing the law. Like, I think there's been some really interesting comments in the chat about, can the master's tools dismantle the master's house? Like, can we really trust the law to be the tool that is going to give us justice? And so when I think about the role of the law in struggles for social justice or decolonization, my position is that the vehicle for transformation is broad-based, cross-class, multiracial social movements led by frontline communities that are developing an expansive vision for the kinds of worlds that we want to see. And this is about building alternatives now. This conference has been such a magnificent example about bringing together people who are actually doing this. I also think that we do need to kind of contend with the state and with law because of their capacity to organize structures of violence. And so we need to contend sort of with state power and with the law, but not thinking that these are going to be kind of the avenues by which we develop justice. It's kind of like a harm reduction strategy, or like, are there moments in which we can use the law, right? In the Standing Rock case, there were people who were using the law to defend sacred sites, to say you're not doing the environmental impact statement, et cetera, et cetera. This is, I'll put my little thing in the chat again. It's like, we need to use invited and invented spaces of action. So we need to, the invited spaces are sort of the official spaces that are offered by the state, participatory, sort of official public comment processes, legal cases, etc. But we also need to make our own spaces. And I can't remember what number it is, but we can't let our actions be determined by legality. We need to let values and ethics lead us. And so I don't think the law or decolonizing the law is sort of the means to getting where we want to go. I do think we need to think about sort of strategically how we can use the law as it is as we work to transform it. And then just one last comment. I think I said those with unearned advantage have more of a responsibility to kind of tame or redirect the state. So I think about sort of indigenous communities, folks being able to provide concrete alternatives and provide visions and blueprints of the kinds of worlds we want to build. And then I think about those of us who have been the recipients of unearned advantage, having kind of a particular responsibility to tame and redirect state capacities away from harm and towards care. And I think thinking about the law, not as the means by which we're going to achieve justice, but as tools that are available that can be potentially repurposed in a specific instance to move us towards that. That would be my response.
All right, we're falling into a pattern and we should break it up. But when I think about the vision, right? So I do a lot of work within criminal justice systems and the ways in which tribes are operating their own criminal justice systems, and the federal government, to the extent they've tolerated that, has really pressured and many times forced tribes to duplicate the adversarial system as sort of the only recognizable legitimate means for, prosecuting, punishing, et cetera, et cetera. And okay, so tribes are doing this in part because it's an expression of authority, and under US federal Indian law, it's a real use it or lose it kind of space. But also because there's objective public safety issues, and there's a missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis. And if we don't do it, literally nobody else is going to. However, I think that there is some to sort of overcome all of these overwhelming barriers. They're starting to do things that are innovative, and they're not doing that in a vacuum. They're not doing that in a silo. It's starting to have these ramifications. I think restorative justice for so long was a theory. It was an idea. It was a notion of wouldn't it be cool if it wasn't adversarial? And tribes that was traditional. And so it wasn't theoretical, and they didn't have to pontificate about it. They just did it. And all of a sudden, we had a tangible example of what that's like. I think environmental protection is such a great example that for so long, right, like the beauty and wonder that is the Environmental Protection Act and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, right, are incredible, but it really has narrowed our vision of what environmental protection means. And meanwhile, tribes are going out here making claims for religious protection and for cultural resource protection. And it seemed like those were cabined in like a separate deal, right? Like, oh, that's like freedom of religion. That's very different. But like the claims are stop over harvesting the sweetgrass because that's not how you're supposed to interact with this. Don't build on that space because that is called these like really basic moves where tribes are, oh, can you hear me? I just got the internet unstable notion. Cool. So I think as tribes have sort of been able to overcome like these waves of like real like explicit like oppression, and again, I keep saying the word genocide, but I don't know if you can say it enough. Like that's a thing that's happening. As tribes have started to inject themselves in this space, they are just by being them are showcasing the ways in which like the expressions of law from an indigenous space, because right, like culture and religion, those are laws. Those are the ways in which we interact with people, and the ways in which we interact with our space are showing some like real innovations. Now, like it also feels like we're in a fork in the road, right? That it's like we can learn from the lessons that are being shown to us, or we can like double down in rejecting them. But I also, this is like not an indigenous source, but it sort of sticks with me, the Aldous Huxley Brave New World example. It's like at the very beginning of the book, but it's commenting on this like, dystopian future. But there's like a small note is like, oh yeah, and then these like Pueblo Indians were over there like just doing their thing. Indigenous people are just so remarkably resilient. Like they're going to persevere and be doing their things. And so I think it's like all of us, like it behooves us, like either we're going to like take some cues or not to our own detriment, but like they're doing their thing. And so like we might as well like enjoy in the bliss of like reorienting the world, because they have visions for the future. And we know this, like that's an objective fact, because their orientation to the past is so deep and dynamic, right? They talk in terms of tens of thousands of years in a way that, right, like Western like history goes back like maybe 2,500 years. It's just shallow in comparison. And I think that we see that in the vision too, right? Like the dominant like politics, like the nature, we talk in 4-year terms, right? We orient like to the next president, and we just don't have like the institutional capacity to plan for things like climate change, because that structurally doesn't fit. So we don't, and it shows. And like, so I think part of like decolonizing the law is just like reimagining what it means to like plan for like future generations.
Lauren's right. We've fallen into a pattern, but that's all right. We didn't think of how to organically throw it back and forth to each other. I've done, I guess my whole professional life as an attorney I've done this strange dance of trying to always be proximate to tribal governments, usually to elected chief executives, presidents, or chairpersons. And I've done that since 2008. I went back to where I grew up. I grew up on the Standing Rock Nation, Standing Rock Res. But part of the reason why I've always tried to stay proximate is because I learned all of the various strategic moves that can be made even within the tribal sovereign framework, as it was designed by those who were crafting the Wheeler-Howard Act or the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, it's still this strange animal, this unknown thing, where on economies of scale, we could, for instance, pursue an alternative to petrochemical, economic realities. Like we have a plastic problem on the planet, but our systems of law, or whether they're the judicial branch or the people that are making the laws, are not demanding something else, nor are they penalizing the way things are going. Those are things that we can do to decolonize the law. Sometimes tribal nations, in order to provide for themselves economically, will invest in the Department of Defense contracts, either through the SBA 8A small business program, or I'm thinking of an Alaskan Native corporation that was profiting off of the capture and trafficking by ICE of indigenous peoples on the USA-Mexico border, which is strange, to say the least. But the way that we see how we're currently getting by, like right now in Thacker Pass, right? The Reno Sparks Indian Colony is the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit, and they do not want a lithium mine to go up in their land, their sacred land, and just their land too. But what is the solution? Like, and how do we do green capitalism in a way that doesn't just run roughshod over indigenous land rights and nationhood rights? And how do we slow down this virus-like consumptive machine, this monster, this leviathan that lives through us, and because of our consumptive patterns that we are coerced into? Speaking of land, where I live on the res, why are we ranching cattle? Why is cattle like the dominant American thing that is completely destroying the land? I go hike every chance I can. I go out and I'm out there, and you can hear nothing. You can hear yourself. It's amazing. But everywhere I go, there's cattle trails. Cattle have already been wherever this system has objectified, commodified, and put a grid on all of the land, all of the private property in this country. So these are just some ways that I think, when I think of what does it mean to decolonize the law, there's too many things that we can do. And you just have to stick to something, find something that gives you a sense of meaning, a sense of strength, a sense of purpose, and pursue that, because that's what's good. That's what's redeemable. That's why I think Standing Rock happened the way it did, because a lot of people were, in my view, offering themselves in defense of elements greater than the human species. And then so those elements are conscious. They're looking to that, and they're working with us. Those of us who are engaged in land defense, that is one way to decolonize the law, is support indigenous sovereignty everywhere. Like tomorrow I'm going to drive all the way to Pihimha, because they're going to be taking a stand out there relative to Thacker Pass. But even informing yourself and sharing the substance or the depths of those struggles that you see happening in our country right now, sometimes that is enough. But I just wanted to say about that much.
I said to our co-panelists, or those of us who are sort of been asked to share our thoughts sort of frontally here that I was really looking forward to the discussion. I have been gaining a lot just hearing from all of you. I really appreciate this opportunity. The only thing I think I might have to add is that I, constantly thinking about what it means to decolonize the law in a time of system change. And we are in a time of system change. We're in a time in which this system is collapsing. It is dying. This world system is not functional. And as I said at the beginning, it's not just people at the bottom and in the middle, but it's folks at the top who see that too. And there will be some kind of new system that will eventually emerge, a generation from now, from everything that we're going through. And of course, I think all of us here want to ensure that that system is the kind of system that can support the kind of society and the kind of living systems that we think everybody deserves, right? But that's not guaranteed. So the question for me about decolonizing the law is, how do the many projects that have been raised sort of fit into a potentially much larger, I shouldn't just say potentially, but a much larger project, right? And how do we accelerate our efforts? And it's a hard thing, because we need to slow down, but we also need to speed up. And urgency can really make building relationships and building movements very difficult. But this urgency has been imposed on us. And just to put it plainly, for me, of course, talking about the climate crises, the mass climate refugee crises that are driven by the climate crisis, and that are going to get ever worse in the next 10 to 20 years. The fascist, nationalist, white supremacist responses to those, and the crisis of disposability, the disposability of working and poor people. And so we've got to figure this out. And I'll stop there.
From the perspective of green energy, I think it's always interesting to think about it, because there's a large subset of people who are very pro-green energy, not necessarily because it's going to benefit everyone, but because they only receive the privilege of the benefit of it at the cost of Black and Indigenous communities. And so we can only exploit the land so much, right, before it just won't exist anymore. Lithium, right? So what is it that should be the means in which we work towards effectuating some type of equity? Like, if decolonizing the law isn't the only means of doing it, how is it that we should be shifting towards this radical new imagined future?
Why don't we switch up the order? Someone else can chime in.
I think let me go first, because I'll be very quick. Switching up the order switches everything up. Working class consciousness, demanding more equity for working people. I always, it's not joking around, and maybe it's sarcastic, but a lot of my family is in the military, but a lot of how we structure our economy, not we, but how those who have their fingers on those levers that decide what the contours of our energy policy and our foreign policy, which usually means what our war machine is doing. We're doing certain things economically just to provide for our weaponry. And so I've always said that soldiers should get a percentage of the money, whatever Dick Cheney is getting in Halliburton in $32 billion a year. Why are not soldiers getting a piece of that? And I say that, I mean, yeah, it's sarcastic, it's facetious, it's something that the elites would never allow. If I'm Dick Cheney, I'm never going to allow that. But it turns on its head this class of people who are sold this patriotic bill of goods. Like my brother and my good friend that I went to high school with, they went to different theaters, you know, Operation Desert Storm, and then Iraqi Freedom. Same place. It's us instigating conflict in the Middle East, and millions of people are dying. They both went because they wanted to defend freedom. And afterwards, they began to deconstruct why they had been sent there. And they're dealing, and there's a whole class of US veterans that is left out in the cold. So I think some practical things that we can do is build alliances with those members of the working class, and those indigenous struggles that sometimes cross-pollinate into those different demographics, and try to build at least coalitions of consciousness. That's like maybe there should be some sort of white paper or something. There's a lot of good heads, good souls, good people who are thinking about what does it mean to be in our shoes right now. It's no accident that we're here right now. Chief Orville Lookinghorse says this quite poignantly and eloquently, that you were not born by circumstance or by accident, that you have a purpose here. And he means all of humanity when he says this. So, you know, I just want to offer always try to be open and building bridges and coalitions. I see that as a way for us to take action in addition to decolonizing the law.
Yes, so much of this is starting from like top down, and like what if we did a bottom up? This is like, I think it's small, but maybe like the small pieces add up, right? But thinking about so many of like fossil fuel energy extraction took place on or adjacent to tribal lands, and we're seeing this exact same pattern play out with, quote, green energy, the placement of solar panels, wind turbines, nuclear, the mining of lithium, copper, all of these things necessary are taking place disproportionately on or adjacent to native lands. And part of that is like, you know, some Native people are into it, eyes wide open, that this offers like an economic opportunity that simply can't be ignored. But what if the like permit approvals included like shares, that like there's like co-ownership in this, and this becomes ours, and so that like we don't just benefit from like a one-time payment of like permission to like do this, and like the future generations are going to have to pay this, but like we get paid in perpetuity, and that like we're part of this. And it's like, well, there was a separate point that, just generally, you know, so much of like the green energy, like I think it's like such like those are the conversations that have to be happening, but they are not sufficiently accompanied by any meaningful discussion about what would it look like if we minimized or even just slightly decreased our energy consumption. There's such like little palette for like our changing our own behaviors. All of us are culpable in this. We're all part of like society, and so like what can we do? But also like we're not even having a conversation about it. And when I see like cryptocurrency get no flack whatsoever for the fact that it is just like gobbling up like massive amounts of energy, it really, I think, sends a disturbing signal that we're only ever going to be using more. We're going to be eating. And so like solar and wind turbines are cute, but they're never going to be enough if we only assume we're going to be using more and more. And it's almost like we're inventing ways to use more energy. And so I think part of this is like, you know, is our vision for the future like exacerbating our current lifestyles? Like, is our vision for our children to be gobbling up the same amount of energy? Do we envision anything else? Do we think that that like mass agriculture is always going to be the way that we eat. And if it's not, then I think taking those small bites of like, how do I envision how this works out? And like, for better or for worse, right? Like the huge snowfall and the great melt that's happening in California is like immediately challenging our approach to massive agriculture in a way that it's like, you might have to get your groceries from somewhere else. Like your grocery store might not have a bunch of like tomatoes and, you know, whatever in it. And so what are we going to do? And I think it's devastating because we haven't done any planning whatsoever, but potentially an opportunity of just like, if we're serious about this, it's not just what my plan for the world is or for the country, but like where do I think my kids are going to get their groceries from? What do I think that's going to happen when they plug their laptop into the wall? Where do I assume that energy is coming from? I realize like these are starting, but cryptocurrency just like it grinds my gears in the sense that it's like, what are we achieving with this? Like it really seems like a farce. Like I couldn't come up with like a funnier joke about like, here's something that adds nothing to the world, but uses a bunch of power. Anyways.
I'll just mix it up a little bit more and jump in. I'll follow up on what you offered, Chase, and I just put in the chat Railroad Workers United. You know, an old friend of mine from the Madison branch of the IWW has been centrally involved with that, and been in touch, and they would, I think, love to have conversations about how their you know, mobilization for public ownership of the railroads should relate to decolonization. So it's just an opportunity, and I think we have lots of opportunities to make these connections. I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think it builds on my earlier comments around multiracial alliances, social movements led by frontline communities. It's about building power. It's about building constituencies with enough power to enact transformative change on multiple levels. And I also think it's about it's about building transformative political imaginaries. And I think this conference is a wonderful example of that. I think decolonization, land back, abolition, defund the police, like we really are living in a moment in which radical political imaginations are being seeded in so many different places. And so some of those are sort of like, you know, reparations, right? These are like big ideas, but there's a commission studying reparations in California right now. And then also in sort of these radical political imaginations, like tackling the thorny questions. I saw a lot of really interesting questions in the chat. Some I think are from my friend and colleague and organizer of the conference, Aaron Gregory, you know, like pushing us to think, well, no, isn't sovereignty itself actually a Western concept? And aren't we capitulating a little bit if we're pushing for indigenous sovereignty? Or like, isn't law actually constitutive of the social relations of capital? And we need to like think about how this works. So I think there is sort of this way that we need these radical political imaginations that are grounded in theory. And like, we need to be students of the moment and the time and asking these big questions. And then also knowing that worlds otherwise are already here. There's so many beautiful experiments all over the place. We've learned about them here, and investing in sort of in prefigurative politics, right? Of enacting the kinds of worlds that we want to see as much as possible in our day-to-day lives. So kind of knowing that the movement as a whole needs to work on multiple different scales. And then figuring out kind of where we fit in, where our energy is, where our gifts are, and getting to work. I'm thinking of there's this, I don't know if I can't remember if I'm going to remember this song. There's a Janelle Monáe song that came out around the election, and one of the lines is "hands dirty, mind clean." And I love that, right? It's like we gotta get our hands messy, we gotta do the work, and we also need to have critical analytical frameworks that are up to the task, right? It's a really tricky political moment in which the articulations between settler colonialism and racial capitalism are complicated and hard to understand, right? So like doing our homework, yeah, both kind of physically and also to invest in having the capacity to imagine and enact worlds otherwise.
Thank you. It is really interesting to think about what we can imagine, because I think what you were saying, Chase, that idea of we're raised within this box, like part of living in the society, being forced to contend with colonialism in all of its forms, is that we have to decolonize our mind just as much as we have to work on having conversations like decolonizing the law. Like, how is it that our indoctrination prevents us from seeing places, not just like in the law, but the ways in which we engage with society as a whole? How is it that our indoctrination prevents us from seeing the way we can achieve true equity in those spaces? So it is really interesting. If you guys could please give some closing remarks as we come to our end mark. Anybody?
Lauren or Ben, one of you have the honor of going first this time, I think.
Yeah, I have a lot more questions coming out of this discussion. I do want to follow up on what Chase, you said earlier. I hope that we do stay in touch, and that I'd like to become part of other circles that others of you may be part of as well, and invite you to work with some of the people that I'm working with most actively in X system studies, and also a growing number of socio-legal scholars as well, working on popular movements and constitutional change. So if anybody's interested who's here and making those connections, please do. It's hard for me to transition to the academic mode because I still think like an organizer. And when I have the opportunity to talk to organizers and activists, then I'll talk in that way. You know, and I am sort of left with the biggest question, which was just raised. I think it was by you, Jennifer, out of the chat, this question of sovereignty. For me, in terms of the constitutional questions, the question of sovereignty and sovereignties are critical. You know, who decides? Where does the authority come from? What are the authorities? How do we figure this out? Many peoples living in proximity to each other, coming out of really complex histories, a lot of them, most of them tortured, to be honest. And I don't know how you do constitutional change without some notion of sovereignty. So that's something I'm going to be sitting with and grappling with, but I want to read more. So send me some stuff. And thanks to all of you for sharing your knowledge and your energy.
Wow. Forgot what I was going to say, but I'll go next. You know, yeah, in Lakota, there's a phrase that we say, "Blihichiapo," and it means take courage. And a lot of people here are taking courage. We were born into a system that is a spiritual dead end. What racialized capitalism and the Enlightenment period and the cultural mythology that the human being is the apex of evolution, in my opinion, has had a net negative impact on, you know, what is happening here, what we've inherited. So what I believe what those systems try to do is disempower the human spirit and just not giving up, not being led into a place of nihilism or despair or meaninglessness, which is where you find yourself. This is where I found myself studying, you know, Western political theory, and I have a lot of respect for knowledge from any tradition, but you know, the indigenous knowledge system, and I'm talking about just the Lakota, which is one of over 500 in what is now called Turtle Island. It compels us to take courage. So not giving up and taking courage continue to do that, because we're in a very harsh place, and the human condition is very, very difficult. That's why we have difficult ceremonies to help us navigate and make sense, find purpose and meaning, continue to seek that out in these ceremonies. Maybe ceremonies might be different for you, wherever you're at, whatever you're doing. But I know you're seeking them because you're here. You're here, which means you're kind of, you're the right kind of, I don't want to use the word crazy, but like you put yourself in situations where you're challenging of something that is oppressive, that not a lot of people see as oppressive. So just continue to take courage. That would be my closing comment.
I agree. That was well said. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate that these types of conversations are happening, and they give me hope.
Yeah, I'll just end saying thank you to the organizers and to my fellow panelists, and for everybody for participating, offering your observations and reflections in the chat. It's been really wonderful. I'll put my my bio link in the chat in case anybody wants to learn about my book. I have a book coming out that explores elite illegalities, outlaw economies, and how that plays out into racial capitalism.
Listen, I forgot to do a shameless plug. We should exchange contact information. I'm working on something with the doctrine discovery with one of the Episcopalian dioceses. I mean, we got professors, we got people who are very interested in this kind of thing. So I don't know if David or one of the organizers can somehow make sure we all got each other's, or there is an email, but please link with each other online, or just reach out to each other. We gotta hype each other up.
Thank you all so much. That concludes our Decolonizing the Law and Policy panel.